He mocked the girl in the mud, only to find she owned the estate he wanted to marry into. She was born to ballrooms but belonged in barnyards. He was heir to an empire but had the heart of a fool. When privilege met compassion on a dusty village road, the sparks that flew would change them both forever. Lady Catherine Ashford wiped mud from her cheek with the back of her gloved hand, making an even bigger smudge across her face. She didn't care. Around her, the village of Little Thornton buzzed with activity as men, women and children worked together to repair the stone bridge. "Hand me that timber, would you, Lady Cat?" called out Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's son. Catherine lifted the heavy beam with practiced ease. "Thomas, how many times must I tell you? Just Catherine will do," she replied with a grin, her expensive riding habit now thoroughly caked with dirt. "Save the titles for those who care about such nonsense." "You're a gift to us, Catherine," said Mrs. Hartwell, the vicar's widow, approaching with fresh bread for the workers. "Many of your station wouldn't soil their gloves for our troubles." "My father taught me that titles mean nothing if we forget the people we stand above," Catherine replied, accepting the warm bread gratefully. The lessons of her childhood had shaped her into everything a proper Regency lady should not be, but she wouldn't change a thing. She had been working since dawn, her dark hair escaping its pins to curl wildly around her face, her boots thick with mud from the riverbank. To any passerby, she looked exactly like what she was in this moment, a young woman who belonged among these people. The sound of approaching horses made several workers look up nervously. Catherine straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun as she watched 4 mounted gentlemen approach. Even from a distance, she could see they were members of the ton. Their clothing perfect, their horses expensive, their bearing that particular combination of boredom and arrogance that marked the wealthy at play. The workers around her began to step back respectfully, but Catherine remained where she was, her jaw setting in a way that spelled danger. From the laughter already drifting across the distance, Catherine suspected this encounter would not go well. "Let them come," she murmured under her breath. What she wasn't ready for was how completely this moment would change the course of her life. Lord Alexander Whitmore spurred his horse forward, eager to impress his companions with his wit. At 26, he had never known want, never worked for anything, and never met a social situation he couldn't dominate through charm or privilege. "Look how quaint they are," Alexander called out, deliberately raising his voice as they drew closer to the bridge construction, playing at being useful, rather like watching children with their toys. His companions, James Crawford and Sir Geoffrey, chuckled appreciatively. The workers had stopped their labour to watch, most bowing their heads respectfully, all except one. A young woman in a mud-stained riding habit stood defiantly among the workers, her chin raised and her dark eyes flashing with unmistakable anger. Her face was streaked with dirt, her hair wild and unbound. Yet something about her bearing struck Alexander as oddly compelling. "My lords," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "if you've come to help, we welcome your assistance. If you've come to mock honest work, perhaps you should continue on your way." Alexander's companions burst into laughter at the audacity. "The little peasant has spirit," chuckled Sir Geoffrey. "Someone should teach her proper respect." Alexander felt his competitive instincts rise. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate his wit while putting an uppity commoner in her place. "My dear girl," he said, with his most condescending smile, "we are merely observing simple folk attempting what proper planning could achieve in half the time. Though I must say," his eyes travelled deliberately over her dishevelled appearance, "you seem quite at home wallowing in the mud. Perhaps you should consider taking up residence in a pigsty. It would suit your presentation admirably." The cruel laughter of his companions filled the air, but Alexander was unprepared for what happened next. The young woman's eyes didn't fill with tears. Instead, they blazed with a fury so intense it made him step back. "And perhaps you should consider whether your pretty words can build bridges, feed families, or mend anything more substantial than your own fragile ego," she replied, her voice sharp as winter wind. "These people have more worth in their muddy fingernails than you have in your entire perfumed person." Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks. Such eloquence from a village wench. "I learned it from someone who taught me that true nobility comes from one's actions, not one's accidents of birth," the young woman replied, her tone deadly calm. Clearly your education was lacking in such fundamentals. With that, she turned her back on him completely, returning to her work as if he were beneath her notice, a dismissal so complete it left Alexander stunned. "Come along, Whitmore," called James. "Let's leave the peasants to their mud." Alexander spurred his horse forward, but found himself glancing back more than once. Something about the encounter left him unsettled. Within the hour, he had forgotten the incident entirely, dismissing it as an amusing country diversion. But the village girl would not forget. And soon, very soon, Alexander would discover that some insults carry a higher price than he could ever imagine. 2 weeks later, Alexander stood in the elegant drawing room of his London townhouse, in excellent spirits about the upcoming social season. He and his companions had completed their country tour and were back in the city where they belonged. "I say, Whitmore," announced his friend James Crawford, bursting into the room with obvious excitement. "Have you heard about the mysterious heiress who's about to make her debut?" Alexander looked up from his correspondence with interest. What mysterious heiress? Lady Catherine Ashford, only the wealthiest unmarried woman in all of England, apparently. She's been living quietly in the country, but word is she's finally decided to take her place in society. Your mother is beside herself with excitement. She's managed to secure the girl's debut for her ball next week. Alexander's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. A wealthy heiress making her debut at his mother's ball. This could be quite entertaining. "What do we know about her?" Alexander asked, settling back in his chair with the satisfied air of a hunter scenting prey. "Not much, which makes her all the more intriguing," James replied with glee. "She's young, beautiful according to those who've glimpsed her, and rich enough to buy half of London. Lord Pemberton is her guardian, and he's been very secretive. All anyone knows is that she inherited vast estates and has been managing them herself." "Managing them herself?" Alexander laughed. "How charmingly a rustic. I suppose someone will need to educate her in proper society behaviour." "Exactly what I was thinking," James agreed. "Perfect opportunity for a man of your particular talents. Imagine, the mysterious heiress guided into society by the charming Lord Whitmore. Very romantic." Alexander smiled with confident anticipation. "Indeed, I do have a certain gift for helping young ladies navigate the complexities of London society. And the fact that she's reportedly worth 50,000 a year doesn't hurt either," James added with a wink. "Naturally," Alexander replied smoothly, "though I'm sure her fortune is merely an added attraction to her undoubtedly considerable personal charms." Over the following days, Alexander found himself genuinely excited about meeting this Lady Catherine. He had always enjoyed the challenge of winning over new conquests, and a wealthy heiress making her debut would be a particularly satisfying prize. He spent considerable time preparing for the ball, selecting his finest evening clothes and practicing his most charming conversational gambits. After all, first impressions were crucial, and Alexander prided himself on his ability to sweep any woman off her feet within the first dance. What he didn't realise was that Lady Catherine Ashford was also preparing for their meeting, but with very different intentions in mind. At Briarwood Manor, Lady Catherine stood before her mirror as London's finest dressmaker made final adjustments to an exquisite gown of deep sapphire silk. But unlike most young ladies preparing for their debut, Catherine's thoughts were not on romance or social triumph. They were on revenge. "You look absolutely magnificent, my lady," breathed Madame Dubois, stepping back to admire her work. "You will be the sensation of the season." Her guardian, Lord Pemberton, entered the room with obvious satisfaction. "My dear, you are going to cause quite a stir. I've already received inquiries about your availability for various dances." "Have you indeed?" Catherine replied with interest. "And what of Lord Whitmore? Will he be attending his mother's ball?" Pemberton's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "Oh yes, he'll be there. In fact, I believe he's quite eager to meet you. Word has it he's been asking questions about the mysterious heiress who will be gracing his mother's ballroom." Catherine's smile grew sharper. "How flattering. I confess I'm rather curious to meet him as well." "Any particular reason?" Pemberton asked, noting something in her tone. Catherine turned back to the mirror, studying her reflection with satisfaction. Gone was any trace of the mud-stained village girl. In her place stood a vision of elegance and refinement that would be unrecognisable to anyone who had only seen her in working clothes. Let's just say that Lord Whitmore and I have some unfinished business to discuss, Catherine said thoughtfully, though I suspect he won't recognise me immediately. Pemberton raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Catherine had always been an independent young woman with her own ideas about how to handle things. As her preparations continued, Catherine found herself genuinely anticipating the evening ahead. She was curious to see how Lord Whitmore would behave when he thought he was courting a wealthy heiress. Would he be as charming and attentive as his reputation suggested? Or would he shower her with compliments and flattery? More importantly, would he reveal whether his character was any different when he believed he was dealing with someone worthy of his respect? The days leading up to Lady Whitmore's ball passed quickly for Alexander, who found himself in unusually high spirits. "You're positively glowing with confidence," observed his mother over breakfast. "I do hope you'll make a good impression on Lady Catherine." "Mother," Alexander replied, with amused confidence, "when have I ever failed to make a good impression on a young lady? I'm sure this Lady Catherine will be thoroughly charmed within the first quarter hour. She's reportedly quite intelligent," his mother warned. "You'll need to be prepared for more than the usual society conversation." "Mother," Alexander replied with amused confidence, "when have I ever failed to make a good impression on a young lady? I'm sure this Lady Catherine will be thoroughly charmed within the first quarter hour." "She's reportedly quite intelligent," his mother warned. "You'll need to be prepared for more than the usual society conversation." Alexander waved dismissively. "All the better. I enjoy a woman with spirit. It makes the conquest more interesting. What could a country-raised girl possibly know about real sophistication?" His confidence was infectious, and by the morning of the ball, Alexander was in excellent spirits. "Tonight," he told his reflection, "Lady Catherine Ashford will discover why I'm considered one of London's most eligible bachelors." James Crawford arrived that afternoon, equally excited about the evening's prospects. "Already planning your victory with the mysterious heiress," James observed. "Let's just say I'm confident the evening will go very well," Alexander replied with satisfaction. Wealthy country heiresses are usually quite susceptible to London charm. I predict Lady Catherine will be eating out of my hand before the supper dance. "And if she proves resistant?" Alexander laughed confidently. "James, when has any woman ever proven resistant to my charms? This Lady Catherine may be wealthy and intelligent, but she's still just a woman." As evening approached, Alexander was filled with anticipation and confidence. Tonight would be another successful courtship, and by season's end, he would likely be engaged to one of the wealthiest women in England. What could possibly go wrong? The ballroom at Whitmore House glittered with 1,000 candles, the cream of London society swirling across the polished floors in a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels. Alexander stood near the entrance with his mother, greeting guests and keeping one eye out for the mysterious heiress, who had captured so much of his attention. "She should be arriving any moment now," Lady Whitmore murmured to her son. Lord Pemberton sent word that they were running slightly behind schedule, but that she looked absolutely stunning. Alexander straightened his already perfect cravat and checked his reflection in a nearby mirror. "I'm sure she'll be worth the wait." "There's Lord Pemberton now," his mother announced, as an elegant carriage drew up to their front steps. "And that must be his ward with him. Oh my, she really is lovely." Alexander turned toward the entrance and felt his breath catch. Walking toward them with serene confidence was indeed one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant style, her sapphire gown fit her perfectly, and diamonds sparkled at her throat and ears. She moved with the assured bearing of nobility, every inch the wealthy heiress he had been anticipating. But there was something about her that seemed almost familiar. Something in the way she carried herself, the tilt of her chin, the direct way she looked at people. "Lady Catherine Ashford," Lord Pemberton announced with obvious pride. "May I present our hosts, Lady Whitmore and Lord Alexander Whitmore." Alexander stared at her, and something in her eyes stopped his breath. But what that something was, he couldn't quite place. Catherine curtsied with perfect grace, her expression pleasantly neutral as her eyes met Alexander's. Lady Whitmore, what a lovely ball. And Lord Whitmore, what a pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about your reputation. Alexander bowed, instantly captivated. She was even more beautiful up close, with intelligent dark eyes and a smile that seemed to hint at hidden depths. The pleasure is entirely mine, Lady Catherine. Might I have the honour of the first dance? How kind of you to ask, Catherine replied with a mysterious smile. I should be delighted. As Alexander led her onto the dance floor, he was acutely aware of every eye in the ballroom following them. The mysterious heiress's first dance was a matter of significant social interest, and he intended to make the most of the opportunity. You seem quite comfortable for someone making her debut in London society, Alexander observed as they began to waltz. Oh, but this isn't entirely new to me, Catherine replied smoothly. I've had occasion to observe London society before, though perhaps not in such formal circumstances. Alexander found her comment intriguing. Indeed. And what observations have you made? Catherine's smile was enigmatic. I've found that one can learn a great deal about a person's character by watching how they behave when they think no one important is watching. Alexander laughed, thinking this was merely philosophical conversation. How true, though I'm sure someone of your obvious refinement has only encountered gentlemen of the highest calibre. Oh, you'd be surprised, Catherine murmured, her voice carrying a hint of dry amusement. I've encountered all sorts, some quite memorable in their behaviour toward those they consider beneath their notice. Alexander was enjoying the mysterious air about her, interpreting her comments as sophisticated banter rather than personal references. Here was a woman who could match him in wit and intelligence, exactly the sort of challenge he enjoyed. Well then, he said with his most charming smile, I shall have to ensure that I prove more memorable than your previous encounters. Catherine's answering smile was brilliant, though there was something in her eyes that Alexander couldn't quite read. Oh, Lord Whitmore, I have a feeling this evening will be quite unforgettable indeed. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself completely captivated by Lady Catherine. She danced with other gentlemen, but seemed to seek out his company repeatedly throughout the night. During the supper hour, Alexander secured a quiet table where they could converse privately. Tell me about your life in the country, Alexander said, leaning forward with practised interest. Oh, quite rustic indeed, Catherine agreed, with a knowing smile. I spent a great deal of time outdoors, working with my hands, getting quite dirty. Some might say I was more comfortable in working clothes than in silk gowns. Alexander laughed indulgently. How charmingly humble, though I'm sure you were always the lady of the manor. Actually, Catherine said thoughtfully, I often worked alongside the common people on various projects, building bridges, improving housing, that sort of thing. How admirably charitable, Alexander replied, though his tone suggested he found such activities beneath a lady of her station. Though surely you must be relieved to leave such strenuous activities behind. Catherine's smile grew slightly sharper. There's something to be said for honest work. Don't you think there's value in all honest labour? Alexander waved dismissively. For those who are suited to it, naturally, but someone of your breeding shouldn't concern herself with such things. Leave the manual labour to those who are better equipped for it. And how do you determine who is better equipped for such work? Catherine asked quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Alexander continued confidently. It's usually quite obvious from their appearance, their manner of speech, their general presentation. One can tell immediately whether someone belongs among the working classes or in refined company. Catherine studied his face with intensity. And if you encountered someone who appeared suited for manual labour, how would you treat them? Alexander laughed. Well, one must be kind to one's inferiors naturally, though there's no need to pretend they're one's equals. A polite but firm reminder of their place usually suffices. Their place? Catherine repeated slowly, her words dripping with barely concealed sarcasm. Exactly. Everyone has their proper station. The key is ensuring they understand it and don't attempt to rise above themselves. Nothing more irritating than presumptuous behaviour from those who should know better. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. And if such a person were to speak back to their betters, then they would deserve whatever correction they received. Alexander replied with conviction. Impertinence should never be tolerated. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was very soft. Tell me, Lord Whitmore, do you ever venture into the countryside? Perhaps to observe rural projects? Occasionally, Alexander replied, pleased she seemed interested. Just recently, I was touring with friends. We came across some villagers working on a bridge project. Quite amusing, really. They were all covered in mud, working away like peasants at their labours. Catherine's hand stilled on her teacup. A bridge project, you say? Yes, somewhere called Little Thornton, I believe. The locals were making quite a production of what should have been simple repair work. And there was this one particularly presumptuous girl who actually had the audacity to... Alexander stopped mid-sentence as Catherine slowly set down her teacup and looked directly into his eyes. Something in her expression made his blood run cold. Had the audacity to what, Lord Whitmore? Catherine asked, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. Alexander stared at her, his mind racing. Those eyes. That way of speaking. The questions about character and working with one's hands. Lady Catherine, he said slowly, his voice growing unsteady, have we met before? Catherine's smile was brilliant and absolutely terrifying. Why, Lord Whitmore, what an interesting question. What makes you think we might have met before? Alexander felt the world tilting around him as realization crashed over him like a wave. The village girl. The mud-stained, sharp-tongued woman who had so thoroughly put him in his place at the bridge. It was her. The wealthiest heiress in England was the peasant he had insulted so cruelly. And she had just spent the entire evening listening to him condemn his own behaviour while he tried to court her. "Oh, God!" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Catherine's smile widened. "I do believe, Lord Whitmore, that you're beginning to remember our previous encounter. How lovely. Perhaps now we can have a truly honest conversation about character, appearance, and the proper treatment of one's fellow human beings." Alexander opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was ruined. Completely, utterly ruined. Alexander sat frozen in his chair, staring at Catherine as the full scope of his situation became clear. She was the village girl, the woman he had insulted so cruelly, so carelessly, and he had just spent the entire evening confirming every cruel opinion she must have formed about his character. "Lady Catherine," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea." "No idea of what precisely?" Catherine asked with deceptive calm. "No idea that the muddy village girl you so eloquently compared to a pig might actually be someone of consequence." Alexander felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Around them, the ball continued in all its glittering splendour, but their quiet table had become the centre of his personal apocalypse. "I was wrong," he said desperately. "Completely, utterly wrong, if I could take back every word." "But you can't," Catherine interrupted, smoothly. "And, more importantly, you wouldn't need to take them back if you hadn't revealed your true character so completely that morning." Alexander looked around frantically, suddenly aware that several other guests were beginning to glance in their direction. Catherine's voice remained perfectly controlled, but there was something in her bearing that suggested danger. "Please," he whispered, "not here. If you have something to say to me, perhaps we could step outside, or—" "Oh, but Lord Whitmore," Catherine said with a brilliant smile, "why would we need to step outside? We're having such a lovely conversation about character and proper behaviour. In fact, I was just thinking how educational it would be to share some of your fascinating observations with the other guests." Alexander's blood turned to ice. "Lady Catherine, please—" "For instance," Catherine continued, her voice carrying just far enough to attract attention, "your thoughts on how one can judge a person's worth by their appearance, or your conviction that impertinence from one's inferiors should never be tolerated." Several guests had now turned to listen, sensing the undercurrent of tension despite Catherine's pleasant tone. "I was wrong about all of that," Alexander said urgently. "My views have evolved since then." "Have they?" Catherine asked with pointed interest. "How remarkable. And when exactly did this evolution occur? before or after you learned that the village wench you insulted could buy and sell you 10 times over?" The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Alexander felt his reputation crumbling around him as more guests began to pay attention to their conversation. "Catherine, please," he said, abandoning all pretense of formality. "Oh, how intimate," Catherine observed, "though I'm not sure we know each other well enough for such familiarity. After all, when we first met, you seemed quite convinced that I belonged in a pigsty. Has your opinion of my suitability for polite company changed?" Alexander wanted to sink through the floor. He could see Lady Pemberton and several other society matrons leaning forward with obvious interest, and he knew that whatever happened next would be all over London by morning. "I was a fool," he said quietly. "A cruel, arrogant fool. You were right about everything you said that day." Catherine studied his face for a long moment, and Alexander thought he detected a flicker of something, surprise, approval, in her eyes. "Well," she said finally, "that is perhaps the first honest thing you've said all evening." She rose gracefully from her chair, and Alexander scrambled to his feet as well, his heart pounding. "Where are you going?" he asked desperately. Catherine turned back to him with a smile that was impossible to read. "Why, to dance with Lord Pemberton, of course. The evening is still young, and I find I'm quite enjoying my introduction to London society." She paused, then added quietly, for his ears alone, "Though I must say, Lord Whitmore, you've given me a great deal to think about regarding the consistency of certain people's characters." With that, she glided away, leaving Alexander standing alone beside their table while half the ballroom speculated about what had just transpired. He remained there for several long minutes, his mind racing. She had not destroyed him yet, but she had made it abundantly clear that she could whenever she chose. His reputation, his future, his entire life now rested in the hands of the woman he had so carelessly insulted. The question was, what did she intend to do with that power? And what, if anything, could he do to convince her that he was worth sparing? The remainder of the ball passed in agony for Alexander. He watched helplessly as Catherine charmed every guest, her wit making her the undisputed success of the evening. Meanwhile, he fielded curious questions from other guests who had sensed tension but couldn't piece together what had happened. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander realised he could not let Catherine leave without attempting some sort of amends. He approached her as she was taking leave of his mother. "Lady Catherine," he said quietly, "might I have a word before you depart?" Catherine studied his face, then nodded. Very briefly. Alexander led her to a quiet alcove. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he began, "but I need you to know that what happened tonight, what I learned about myself tonight, has changed me." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Has it indeed? And what exactly have you learned?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I learned that I am exactly the sort of man I always claimed to despise. Someone who judges others by their appearance, who treats people differently based on their perceived status." Catherine waited silently. "I learned that I insulted and dismissed someone remarkable, because I was too arrogant to see past the mud on her dress to the intelligence in her eyes, the dignity in her bearing, the compassion in her actions." Alexander's voice grew stronger. "But most of all, I learned that I have been wasting my life on shallow pursuits when I could have been doing something worthwhile." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "And what do you intend to do with this newfound knowledge?" Alexander met her eyes directly. "I intend to become someone worthy of your respect. Not to win your forgiveness, I don't deserve that, but because you've shown me what it means to be truly noble." For the first time all evening, Catherine's smile seemed genuine. "That, Lord Whitmore, is perhaps the first thing you've said that gives me hope for your character." "Then you won't, that is, you don't intend to—" "Ruin you," Catherine finished. "No, Lord Whitmore, I think you've done quite enough of that yourself tonight. The question is, what will you do now that you understand who you really are?" Alexander felt relief followed by a different kind of pressure. Would you allow me to prove that I can change?" Catherine considered this. "There's a bridge in Little Thornton that still needs finishing," she said finally. "If you're truly serious about learning to be better, you might start there." Alexander's face lit up with hope and determination. "I would be honoured, Lady Catherine. "We shall see," Catherine replied. "Actions, Lord Whitmore, are far more convincing than words." 6 months later, Alexander knelt in the mud beside the river in Little Thornton, working alongside Tom Miller and the other villagers to complete the bridge repairs. His hands were calloused now, his back ached from honest labour, and his expensive clothes had long since been replaced with practical work attire. "Hand me that timber, would you, my lord?" called out Tom with a grin. "Just Alexander will do," he replied, hefting the beam with muscles strengthened by months of manual labour. "Save the titles for those who care about such nonsense." Catherine, working beside him as she had that first morning, smiled at his echo of her own words. The transformation in Alexander had been remarkable to watch. He had thrown himself into learning, not just about physical labour, but about the lives and struggles of the people he had once dismissed. "You've come a long way from the man who suggested I belonged in a pigsty," Catherine observed as they paused for a drink of water. Alexander winced at the memory. "I still can't believe I said such a thing, though I suppose it led me here, which I can't entirely regret." "And where is here exactly?" Catherine asked with a smile. Alexander looked around at the bustling construction site, at the villagers who now called him friend, at the bridge that would soon connect the community to opportunities beyond. But most of all, he looked at Catherine, her face streaked with honest dirt and glowing with the satisfaction of meaningful work. "Here," he said quietly, "is exactly where I belong." Catherine's answering smile was brilliant. "I rather think you're right." As they returned to their work, Alexander reflected on how completely his understanding of worth and nobility had changed. He had discovered that true satisfaction came not from being served, but from serving. That real strength lay not in power over others, but in lifting others up. And he had learned that the most beautiful woman he had ever met was one covered in mud and devoted to helping her community, not because of what she owned, but because of who she was. The bridge was nearly complete now, stronger and more beautiful than the original. Rather like, Alexander thought with a smile, the man who had helped build it. Some transformations, he had learned, were worth every moment of humiliation it took to achieve them. And some lessons could only be learned by those humble enough to accept that they had been very, very wrong. "Catherine," he said softly as they worked side by side. "Yes. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have, for giving me the chance to become someone better." Catherine looked at him with warm affection. "Thank you for proving that people really can change when they finally understand what they need to change into." As the sun set over Little Thornton, casting golden light across the nearly completed bridge, Alexander realised he had found something far more valuable than social conquest or material success. He had found himself, and perhaps if he continued to prove himself worthy, he might even find love.